Welcome to Old Path and our Thursday studies through the New Testament. We are currently in the book of Revelation, and we are currently also in the 17th chapter, which we will complete today. It'll have taken us 3 weeks to get through it, but it's just, I think, very, very important to take your time with this, because what we're looking at here, and this section is a great case study in any time that we're looking at something that is dealing with prophecy. It might look different to your eye at any particular point in time. And since I first was saved, the beliefs of what this could actually be has changed a little bit over time, and I'll get to that when we get into the text. But it's just a great example of how we might look at prophetic passages based on realities, especially geopolitically speaking, in the world at that particular time. So it's just been interesting to watch how that's changed. So we'll get through this, and we're going to do a little bit of repeat of some of the stuff that we dealt with last week, just because really it does continue on. Where we had to kind of stop because of time last week, we will get back into a little bit because it's kind of a running narrative, and they're a bit dependent on one another. That'll all make sense here in just a moment as we go through it. So before we get into the text, very, very quickly, I've been doing apologetic things, which we are making into their own little pieces as well. And so we're putting those out on YouTube, and they're available to be viewed just as simple topics. The one that we're going to look at today is just when it comes to how conspiracies, and people will see world events as conspiracies. And I want to look at that a little bit and address it, because it's interesting. Every time some major thing happens around the world, you'll have a lot of people, I think, sometimes read into particular topics a bit more than is useful. Certainly, whatever's happening around the world certainly fits very, very well into prophetic matters, depending on what they are. And so what we want to try to do is never read too much into them, but also never minimize them as well, the importance of them, why they're happening, and what relevance they might have to the scriptures. So I want to kind of see, how do we strike the balance between those two things? So I want to deal with that after, and so if you stick around, we'll get into that topic and kind of close with that. So I have a couple of things I'm going to do in this. I want to put up a couple of slides as we kind of begin this today, looking through these passages, because I think that they're very, very helpful. And it's, even in the circles, if you will, of other Bible teachers that view the end times as I do, and about maybe even the rapture of the church and the timing of things, they might not necessarily agree on some of the nuances that we see in the passages here, which is just a great way of showing us that God will give us big picture things, but some of it is just, it's going to be a little bit left to the interpretation of the person looking at it. Certainly when they're all taking place, when all of this is happening, it's going to be plenty obvious. So if we were reading the passages that we're reading here in the time when they're actually happening on earth, there wouldn't be any doubt who the 10 kings are, the seven kings, or the kingdoms. We'll get into the 7 and the 10 in this, because what we find is that there's a great compatibility between what John sees and also what Daniel sees. Because we're going to go back to Daniel. I referred to them last week, but I'm going to actually want to point back to them. We're going to turn to the passages themselves and read them in their context, and we'll be able to notice from that pretty clearly that what John is seeing is exactly what Daniel saw. Of course, John is seeing it contemporary to his time. The dominant nation that's really kind of in control of the world as they knew it is Rome. At the time of Daniel was there from the time of the Babylonians through into the Persians. So their world looked different. Now, they both would understand. Of course, Daniel is able to see the world empires. The first one that he gets, we're going to look at it in chapter 2 of Daniel, is during the time of Babylon in their heyday under Nebuchadnezzar. But he would be there for the inferior second kingdom that takes place under the Persians. He was there for the transition of those things, and he prophesied about the one that would come after, being Greece, and then of course Rome. But he leaves it very, very open-ended when it comes to Rome. He leaves some very interesting details for us in that, and so we're going to take a look at those little bits and the details that are there. but then also how, well, when John starts to give us more details from the time when he's looking at Rome as the contemporary of his time, and the vision that he ends up seeing, or what is shown to him in the woman and in the beast, is for him to understand the ancient aspect of it, but being, as he's able to look at the fourth of those empires in real time, in his time, but then seeing something down the road where someone's going to come out of what is in his current time, but it's going to be at a future interval. So obviously we're still here, and there's no historical fulfillment that really does satisfy the vivid detail that's given to us by John and by Daniel. People try to fit them into historical past events, and yet unfortunately, they just don't fit. And so it's good for us to recognize we don't have to take liberties with the text. What we really need to do is just wait and see until these things have their actual fulfillment. So really important that we can understand the distinction between those things. So what I want to do is let's turn then to the book of Revelation, chapter 17, and that's where we'll begin today. We're going to look back at a couple of verses before our actual text, which begins in verse 12, and then kind of go back and look a bit at what is being spoken of. I mentioned it last week. Hopefully it was clear enough, but I want to put up, for the sake of the succession of it, I want to go back and look at the details of the first part of what John is able to see, of the kings and of the mountains, and then ultimately another 10 that are mentioned after. So the idea of 7 and 10, when it comes to the numbers of kings and kingdoms, shouldn't come as any surprise again, because there's real great crossover information in both Daniel and in Revelation. Clearly they're talking about the same events. Daniel gives us a lot of detail. John gives us a lot of detail. When you put the two pieces together, it really helps to form a great deal. Now, I'll make mention of it a little bit, but when we look at Daniel chapter 9, because it's another separate thing, we want to make sure that that's also included in our discussion, though we're not really being introduced to kings in the sense of the 7 and the 10 and all that stuff. What we focus on in Daniel chapter 9, starting at verse 24, is really looking more at the Antichrist and how he comes to rise in that 70th week of Daniel. So chapter 9 starts at verse 24 and runs through verse 27. So what we get is really some details about what the Antichrist will do that mirrors perfectly what we see starting at chapter 13 of Revelation. When will that take place? It's when Messiah is cut off. There's one last 7-year interval of events, and that's what helps us in our understanding of what takes place during the tribulation. So we get that detail there. The Antichrist is shown as to who he is and the things that he will be doing that, again, John gives us a great deal of detail. We also get detail about him as being that little horn that does the things that he does that Daniel talks about earlier in his chapter. So what I want to go to do is look a little bit at Revelation 17, and then I want to bring up a couple of slides we'll do in succession as we look back through and start to answer the question of the crossover of kings, the number 7 and the number 10. It's not a numerology thing. It's really they say there are these things that represent these things. In the case kings and kingdoms, the numbers 7 and 10 are very much universal between John and Daniel, and they use them interchangeably, and you'll see that when we look through them. But the important part is to never look at any particular passage just in a vacuum. If there's anything else that the scripture can speak about on a particular topic, we want to look at all of it so that we have a full understanding of what was, in this case, seen by Daniel a long time ago, 2,600 years ago, roughly, 25, 26, and what we're seeing in John's perspective from a couple thousand years ago, as far as we're concerned. They're separated by 500 years, just using round figures. They're separated by basically 500 years and two major kingdoms that were future to Daniel's time, that being Greece and Rome. To John, of the 4 that are mentioned, the 4 major world empires that are mentioned by Daniel in chapter 2 and chapter 7, John has seen all of them historically. One of them is in existence at his time. So we'll look back a little bit at that because I think it's really helpful to our discussion. So let's, having turned to Revelation 17, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to come before you and to study your word. We would pray that you would give us ears to hear the importance of the details that are here and why it's important that though we won't be here for it, yet nonetheless it helps us to understand the world that's taking shape in front of our eyes. And may we be attentive to this. May we be paying attention to the things that are here. So we give you all thanks. We pray that you would be glorified as we study your word and that you would open our understanding to these things, that we'd be able to grasp the importance of it. So we give you all thanks and praise, and we ask that you'd be glorified in our study in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 17, what I want to do is look back at a couple of things that we had on as far as details just last week. So what we read in verse 10, it says, verse 9 of chapter 17, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So the important part when it comes to the 7 heads and mountains, they are things that are they're equated with the beast, not with the woman. The woman sits on these things. But notice there's not a distinction that there are these, as he says here, the 7 heads and the 7 mountains. It's not that they're 2 different things. The one is the other. So the heads are the mountains. So this is the one problem. We would love it, where it would be nice for us to be able to say, John, why don't you just tell us that these are kings and kingdoms? It's pretty obvious that that's the case, but images are given and there's details to the images. So when he's seeing a vision, it's a vision, something that he's able to see. Some would call it dreams, other ones would just call it visions. In this case, God is showing him through images that he sees, which really helps him to relate to what it was that Daniel had seen. So when we see chapter 2 in Daniel, that's Nebuchadnezzar that has that, and what Daniel does is interpret it. By chapter 7, what you get in Daniel is that God shows him a vision of really the same details that were shown to Nebuchadnezzar, and just different detail. So in Daniel, it's an image that Nebuchadnezzar sees, and Daniel interprets it. When he sees what he sees in chapter 7, it's a vision that's given to him, and then there's the interpretation. Both have the same thing. An image, and an image in chapter 2 is not only seen by Nebuchadnezzar, but then interpreted through Daniel. In chapter 7, the beasts, the 4 world empires, are shown to him as beasts, and then he is given the interpretation there as well, but he's still looking at the same. The same 4 world empires that are shown to him at that time are, of course, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those 4. Those are mentioned. Daniel gets the details on both of those. It's the same 4 empires that he sees. Something's introduced to us different in John because it goes back even further into history. And that's why I think it's also helpful to us, because the woman and the beast are seen as cooperative in this. And if we understand what's meant by these 7, and not everybody agrees, but I really do favor this as time's gone on, and reading more and kind of studying through this, and then watching how world events have kind of changed, that gives a different perspective to our understanding about this particular vision that John is seeing and the details about it. So he mentions here these heads, which are mountains. They're one in the same. They're just 2 different ways of giving what is a visual cue of the things that he is seeing, but it's basically the same thing. So what he ends up saying, here's the mind which is wisdom, in which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So they carry her along. The 7 mountains had long been believed, and many still do, that it's speaking of Rome and the mountains there. But it says that these are kings and mountains upon which she sits. And if we're looking at a much more ancient view of it, which I think the next verse helps us to understand, that helps us in our understanding of who she is. Because she's referred to as the mother of harlots, or harlotry, and the abominations of the earth. So that didn't all start with Rome. That happened well before that, because the abominations of the earth began well before that. So if that's the tack that we take, that she's seen as being very ancient, and the beast, same way. the spiritual aspect of it is from ancient times. And again, remember the focus of all of this, and during this time, Israel and the Jewish people are the main focus of it, though it's a worldwide judgment that God is making. It's the whole earth that's being judged, but all of these things are happening in what is modern day Israel. That's the function. Unless people start to do all kinds of spiritualizing of the text, you look at this and say, look, there's a temple, there's all the stuff that's happening. When we take in the prophetic things, especially like Zechariah, which is mentioned, there's a thing that is said in Zechariah which helps us to understand we're looking at the same events even from Zechariah's time. Jesus comes back and he basically comes to the aid and the assistance of Israel and Jerusalem in particular when they're surrounded by their enemies, and he's the one who makes war and destroys the encroaching enemies that are there. So when we read this, it tells us in verse 10, there are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue for a short time. And that's where I kind of want to stop here for just a moment. And I want to pull up a slide that will help us to kind of look through the details of this. So I want to bring that up right now, and I think that'll be really helpful for us to kind of look at what I think the most favorable, given where we are in time, of the understanding of what these ones are as we get this detail. 5 have fallen, 1 is, but there's still 1 that's to come, which gives us the 7. 5 plus 1 plus 1 equals 7. So I think it's a cue for us to start looking, okay, what would fit that narrative given the context of everything that we've looked at so far. So let me bring that up now, and I think it'll be really helpful to us. Okay, so as we look at this, this insert here, this panel, and we're looking at what John has to say to us there in verse 9, notice where he mentions that 5 have fallen. So here's the way that this is looked at. And again, I'll be the first to admit it, not everybody agrees on this. But if we're looking at 7, and especially it's because of that 5 that have already fallen. If I'm off on this, we really don't have any other way of explaining it. It could be something completely different. I don't dispute that for a moment, but we won't have a real good understanding of what it is. So again, we can start to run this clock, if you will, because again, the Jewish people and the nation of Israel is very much the focus of what we see here in Revelation. That nation, as far as the people that lived in the land and the world powers that would have been there at the time, if you want to start that at the really kind of the birth of the nation, when the Exodus takes place and they come into the land and begin to occupy it, even back in Abraham's time, they hadn't done it. It was promised to him. And as far as world empires, we don't hear a whole lot about them at the time. But by the time that the children of Israel are kind of established, especially in the land, that's when we start to see, well, Egypt was the main player in the world. And yet they're defeated, and gives way to the Assyrians. And then from that point on, rather, we start to see where it would start to pick up in what Daniel was talking about of the 4 empires after that. So those ones would be, of course, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. Those ones are all since past. So if that's how we view the 5, now we may be on to something, because then the second part of that, let's take a look again at verse 10. There are also 7 kings. So the mountains and the 7 heads that the woman sat upon is really what you see there as far as the beast is concerned, would be kingdoms and kings. That's what verses 9 and 10 are talking about, kingdoms and kings. The kings are not mentioned by name, but you have a head of a nation. So it's not that we're having to worry about who to identify them with, because each of these, like Egypt and Assyria, you can think of the pharaohs, you can think of Sennacherib if you want to, as far as Assyria. There are memorable people that were heads over each of them. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar when it comes to Babylon. And then as far as Persia is concerned, you have Cyrus, but you have Xerxes, Artaxerxes, major figures. So you can't really necessarily narrow it down to any one, but there are kings and kingdoms that are important, that are in mind here. And if it was important enough, we would have been given all of the detail. it would be told to us who is in mind here as far as any particular king. But every king, or every kingdom rather, would have had a king as we would understand at any snapshot in time. So, same thing as far as Greece. Alexander the Great's the one that we think of, but the four that took over after him, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus, those are the four that kind of come to mind, and that we see when he said divided among the strong. We can see those were the ones who really took over the territory of what was Greece. So, if that's your five, it fits. And then the one that you see here, the one that is, as John is seeing this, though everything that they're going to do that's being described to us happens future, John, though, is still writing this down at the time that Rome is. So as he is seeing this, he's seeing her in her ancient personification and the beast as well, because there's a symbiotic relationship that's there. Any of the harlotries and any of the abominations of the earth, the devil's really the author of all of that. So it doesn't matter who's doing it at any one time, the author of it remains the same. So in this case, the beast is indwelt by Satan, who has been the one who's been doing these abominations through his agencies and his agents through the ages. So what you see here, once again, is a time when we're going to read as we go through this, the woman is ultimately an inconvenience at some point in time during the tribulation, and she's done away with. So he has no use for her anymore. He becomes the world dictator that happens at the abomination of desolation. And at some point in time after that, he's going to finish her off. That we get, it's pretty easy for us to nail that down. We're going to see that in the closing verses of chapter 17 here. And then chapter 18 is going to give us the details of how that happens. So if this is the case, the five that have fallen, we've got there on the page, and then the first, or the one that is currently at the time that John is writing this, Rome is the big player on the world stage. But we do know that after he's gone, as time goes by, Rome does conquer Jerusalem and the people are dispersed, but Rome is not conquered as much as it does fall apart. And then ultimately, it's going to then be established. The other has not yet come. That gets us to 7. The 5 plus the 1 plus the 1. So if that's how we view this, then it makes good sense, and we don't have to concern ourselves with the 5 that have already gone because they've already fallen. It's what happens in the one that is current to John's time, Rome. And when we start to read the details that we get in Daniel, you start to realize that fourth beast, which represents Rome, is explained to us in such a way that she kind of ceases to exist, but something shows that there's going to be another part to it. There's a 2-component bit to it that we're going to get when we look at chapter 2 that's there. Now, let me put up the next slide. Now, this one is dealing with 10 horns. So important for us and for our study here, as far as this is concerned, is to try to determine the difference, what's with the 7, what's with the 10. We've kind of had a chance to look at the 7 that are here, and then the one that comes out of them being the Antichrist. And again, we'll get to that a little bit more when we get back to Revelation. But for what we're looking at here, I think it's really important for us to look at the details that are given to us in Daniel's 2 visions, or the 2 chapters in Daniel. One, the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, and the other, the vision of Daniel that he gets himself. Now, I have mentioned here, when it comes to the idea of 10 horns, that is a familiar bit of detail that we've been given. And if we take a look at the actual 7th chapter, take a look at verse 7, and we see that he receives this. Actually, let's start in verse 1 of chapter 7. It says, "Now in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream in visions on his head while he was on his bed, and then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirred up on the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other." So he goes through and he starts to give the details. In verse 7, the focus would then be on the 4th of those empires. "After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, and it had huge iron teeth, Iron being interesting based on what we saw in chapter 2, and we're going to go there in a moment. It was devouring, breaking into pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Important, 10 horns. So let's go from there, and let's go back then to, or let's go forward, I should say, to what he sees in the interpretation of that. So from verse 7, we go to what he saw versus what God shows him as far as the interpretation of it, and that starts at verse 24. Then he said, and this is the interpretation of it, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it into pieces. Then the 10 horns, so once again, the 10 horns are 10 kings who will arise up from this kingdom. So the 10 that are going to be given rise or be given that are going to show up as a result of it, this is why people really believed that the 10 horns that are mentioned in this were going to be the European Union. And I'll go back to that here in just a moment. In verse 20, the second part of verse 24, and another then will rise after them, and he shall be different from the first ones. Sounds exactly like what we're reading in Revelation, because it is. It's the same thing. And it says, and he will subdue 3 kings. So he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He will persecute the saints of the Most High, and he will intend to change times and law. Then the saints will be given into his hand for a time and times and half times. Interestingly enough, that is the second part of the tribulation. So it's that he is the one who's going to reign during that time. We've already read about that in great detail in the book of Revelation. So in Daniel chapter 2, let's go there, because I believe that it's important that we see that as well. So we know the story in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar sees this image and he's troubled by it, calls together all the people that should be able to give him the interpretation as they think. He calls the soothsayers and all the occultists of his kingdom, and they're saying, well, tell us what you saw and we'll give you the interpretation. He says, no, I'll do better. I want you to tell me what I saw, and then you tell me what it is, and if you can't, I'll kill you. And none of them could, so they're all slated to die, including Daniel. And at that point, Daniel is asked about it, and so he says, well, let me seek the Lord on it, and I'll tell you what's going on. So we read about the details of that in verse 31. It says, you, O king, you were watching. This is the first part of it. This is I'll tell you what you saw. And God shows it to him, obviously. You, O king, you were watching, and behold, a great image. This image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, showing the distinction and the difference between the two. So it's that fourth image, it's that fourth beast, or that fourth part of the image that is of such importance here. Notice that the other ones, the other parts of it, the gold, the silver, and the bronze, had no separation. They're all one thing. In this case, what he saw with iron, and remember that fourth beast that we just read about in chapter 7, iron is mentioned. The teeth are like iron, and then it's ferocious. It's vicious. As Nebuchadnezzar sees this, that last kingdom, that fourth kingdom of iron, is one that also has a fragile part of it, and it's two parts. It's iron, but the feet are iron mixed with clay. Now, the one thing that's not mentioned here, every foot has 5 toes and it has 2 feet. So there's an implied part to this that there would be 10 toes with it as well. That would fit everything else that we've seen from chapter 7, having the 10 horns, and also what we see in the book of Revelation, obviously, of the 10 horns. So we read on. You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Notice that this iron, or that's one that's made without hands, we're speaking about Jesus here as he comes back and destroys this reestablished iron mixed with clay. He doesn't go after the legs. That was the first Roman Empire. Jesus comes back and subdues and makes war against those that are allied with him. We're going to read more about this as we get through into chapter 19, but this is helping us to understand that everything that John sees of the end of this last empire, everything that's being mentioned to us in chapter 17 pertaining to the beast, Jesus ultimately comes and wipes it out. But notice again, he only focuses on the feet in the clay, not the legs, because there's something that happens later. The division of that is very, very precise, and it's there for a reason. So the iron and the clay, the bronze and the silver, the gold, they were all crushed together, and they became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, which is just a way of saying that he's going to put an end to everything of man's power through the ages. And as he finishes this off, all world empires are subdued by him, and he becomes King of Kings and Lord of Lords over everything that has ever occurred up to that time. We'll read about all of that when we get to chapter 17. Now, when we get to the interpretation part of this, that's what we start to read as we look at verse 40. So, this is the interpretation. The fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks into pieces and shatters everything, like iron that crushes, that kingdom will also break into pieces and it will crush the others. Whereas you saw the feet. Notice there's a real distinction and a focus on the legs. It's going to crush the other kingdoms and subdue them. They'll be done. That happened during Rome's time when Rome was the major force on earth. It wiped it all out. So look at the Roman Empire and how much it occupied. When you think about Rome, Italy, and how small of an area that is relative to the rest of the world, look at the expanse of the Roman Empire in its heyday, and it subdued all the rest. However, notice there's a break in this narrative. It shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break into pieces and crush the others. However, whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, that kingdom will be divided, and yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the clay. And as far as the toes of the feet, they are partly iron, partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. So this looks forward to the reestablishing. I don't think there's any other way that we can explain it, because there's so much of an emphasis on the idea that there are the legs, but then there are the feet and the toes, and all of it is mixed. It's a remnant of what was, but it's fragile. So again, that helps us with our understanding that, like Rome was dominant and it controlled everything, this kingdom will have its fragile bits as it begins to develop, but there will be one who will come out of it who will not have those same kind of problems. So as we look at it in our world today, anything that anybody tries to put together as if you will, a world empire is going to have some extreme limitations. And what it'll take is somebody to kind of take the reins of the whole thing. So let's turn back to Revelation, but let's start at chapter 13 again, because we're trying to deal with this idea of the 10 horns. Now you'll notice on the slide here, I mentioned Daniel, and you can go read it. We won't do it today. It's not really dealing with horns, but it really deals with that one little horn that comes out, the one that will subdue the rest. That you get a little bit more of the details and more the timing of it, when he comes back and when will that all take place, and the idea that it's the 70th week of Daniel, it's 7 years. During the midway point of that is when he's going to do what he does, setting up the image, the abomination of desolation, all the things that we've been studying about from chapter 13 onward in Revelation. So back to Revelation, when we look at chapter 13, because we're looking at the image of, or the imagery, if you will, of that idea of the 10 horns. So it's not as though what we're reading in chapter 17 is without precedent. Clearly it is. Daniel chapter 7 says it clearly, that there are 10 horns. I believe that there's little doubt that it coincides with what would be the 10 toes, because obviously the image that's there is going to have feet, and if you have feet and you have 2 of them, you're going to have 10 toes. So every foot, unless something's happened to it, is going to have 10 toes. So I think it's implied as far as I'm concerned. So then chapter 13 verse 1 tells us this: I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a great beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his 10 horns there were also 10 crowns. So there we have that imagery. And then when we get back to chapter 17, as we look, you'll notice that there are also in verse 12 mentioned 10 horns. So that helps us with our understanding that this imagery is not unique to John and the book of Revelation. It is also spoken of, and there's really no problem with overlap between the two things that Daniel saw and what John is seeing here. Let's remember there's something else at the close of Daniel's book. And he's told, now close up the words of this prophecy for until the times of the end. And so John is then told, now write these things. So what you basically are able to see, it's kind of bookends. It's that Daniel is shown a great deal of information, especially when we get into the 12th chapter. We start to get into the Antichrist and the things that he does, the abomination of desolation's mentioned there. But then he's told, that's as much as you're going to see now, more will come later. John is the one who's now writing about the things coming later. And I do think it's really important that we should look at this, that there are things that are given to John that are not necessarily exclusive to him. I think we've looked at this, but in the 15th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is able to see a lot of very intriguing stuff. The idea that Jesus delivers the kingdom back to the Father, he puts down death and Hades, he conquers the grave and he conquers death itself. That's something that we read about in the 20th chapter of Revelation. So Paul saw it 30 years prior. So there's some really interesting things that the apostles would have known as the Lord showed them things, but John is seeing everything kind of in a running narrative, and God is showing him details that really don't find anywhere else. So John is, if you will, adding a lot of color to the images that we've been given through Daniel. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 in particular is speaking about the exact same things that we're seeing here when it pertains to Rome. That's what we want to try to keep in mind and make sure that we fully understand. So let's turn back to chapter 17 and let me pull down the slides. Now, what we pick up in verse 11, it says, the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and it is this. He is one of the 7 that is going into perdition. Now, this is one of the things that has kind of confused people, and there's a few different views of what this might actually mean. Why is it mentioned? Why is he mentioned as the 8th from among the 7? So we know of the 7th, 5 are gone. The only candidates that we have that he could come out of is Rome. And since it's still future to our time, there's going to be something that will be kind of out of the seat of Rome. There's going to be a revived version of the Roman Empire. These the 10 horns that are mentioned next are going to be kind of an interesting thing for us to take a look at. But when it comes to this, there are a couple of reasons. Why is he referred to as the 8th and not just the 7th? Well, it doesn't give much of I don't think there's much really of a way of disputing it, that the last empire that needs to come has to be something to do with Rome because of Daniel 2 and because of what we have here. But he's mentioned as the 8th, and here's a couple of the plausible reasons why. Is it because he was one who was and then died and is now brought back to life? We know that he has a mortal wound, and not just the kingdom, but the king itself, and he's revived. He's brought back to life and resurrected. So is that what qualifies him to be the 8th? He was and he was not, but he now is. That's one of the options. The other option is that it's a way of determining or defining him as one who comes out standing above all the other ones who have ever been as far as Rome is concerned. So making him one who comes out of the Roman Empire and the kings that have been there, even though it's reestablished, and he becomes the central focus. He's the one that is mentioned above them all. There's also another possibility, and that is that there was, at the time that Rome rises, and it won't take a whole lot for that to actually happen when you think of Europe, for him to come out of that. And he would be the one who represents, or actually somebody would be in charge of it, if you will, and then he takes over. He becomes the 8th coming out of that 7th, Rome. So there's the possibilities. Is it because he was and he died and yet he was resurrected, making him the 8th? Is he the eighth because he's the one singular king that comes out of Europe? And that added little extra caveat, there was a seventh king over that last kingdom, Rome, and he's the one who takes his place. He's that one gives place to him. I'm hoping that made sense. But again, you can look at a lot of people who would agree with me on the chronology of things, and they have the same eschatology, and they might differ a little bit on what makes him the eighth, but we really know ultimately, when we get rid of all the different possibilities, we're talking about the Antichrist here. Not much of a question. Clearly, we see that from the rest of the verses. Now, here's one other place where it starts to get a little bit interesting when people start to look at it. Verse 12. So, the 10 horns which you saw, they are 10 kings. Okay, so that makes it really easy for us to understand. These ones have received no kingdom as yet, but they will receive authority, but they do receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. So when John is seeing this, they're not in existence yet, but they will be. So John sees them in, I guess you could say, kind of in the potential. So even the heads and all the stuff that's there, John sees it in his time. He sees Rome as it sits personally at his time, but he sees the revised part of it. They're not on the world scene as he sees it at the time that he's alive, but down the road, they're going to be there. Now, I remember being around when the European Union started to explain that they were going to have a common currency, and they were going to eliminate their borders. They would still be sovereign nations, but they would be so cooperative that they could have a common currency. And if you were a member of the European Union, you wouldn't need a passport to get from country to country type of a thing. They weren't going to have those kind of borders. That's the way that it was being discussed. And so a lot of people thought that, well, there's the revived Roman Empire that's being spoken of, and that's what's going to be the 10 nations, as we see here in the book of Revelation. Well, they started to add more and more and more countries, and so that 10 was gone. So I don't think it was supposed to be in any way figurative. That's how people tried to explain it away. Well, it says 10, but it might not literally be 10. I have a problem with that because of how many other places 10 is mentioned very descript. We've already looked at it in not only Revelation 13, but what we see in Daniel, and again, what we saw with Daniel, the implication of the 10 toes. So I've never had a real problem, or I've always had a real problem with that. And I've always, if I was going to think of this as being a revived Roman Empire of the European Union, somehow you've got to get to a literal 10. So do some drop off, what else may be, but they keep adding on. And it starts to give you a reason why you might want to think maybe there's another alternative here. Well, we do know that not only, there's a couple of different ways that that's been looked at, and I know that the World Economic Forum has looked at it that way, the Club of Rome has looked at it that way, even the UN, but they've thought about how is it that we could, for reasons of governance, we could actually divide up the world into 10 sections, 10 parts, dealing with continents and sections of continents. So as far as we were concerned, our section here in the United States, and there's pretty much, they all look pretty much the same. The one that the WEF has been thinking about, the World Economic Forum, or the UN, or even the Club of Rome, they're all the same people that kind of rub elbows in those places. But to divide up the whole world so that it can be seen as a way that can be governed in a global sense. So the North American would be us, Canada, and Mexico, but that would leave the South American. You can see it on if you pull it up on the internet. I didn't bother with it because there's a lot of different versions of it, depending on who's putting it out, but it's still ultimately the same thing. Can we divide up the whole of humanity into 10 parts? Interestingly enough, that they came up with that idea. They certainly didn't do it because of the Bible. It's more that that's what they're thinking. The Bible tells us that's what they're going to ultimately do. That would seem to work a little bit better with the world as it currently sits. So when it was, back in the late 1990s, that was really, could it be the European Union? Because they're talking about common currency. It's the right part of the world. I have no problem to believe that the Roman Empire is reestablished, but that doesn't mean that it's got to be the 10 nations of the European Union. Notice that these 10 kings that end up ultimately coming on could very easily be the 10 regions of the world that they're divided up. because they work in conjunction with the Antichrist at this point. They don't have to be from the same place as he is. They're just going to function with him. They're not kings at John's time, so they're still future. So it doesn't really fit necessarily when you really start to look back on it, especially in light of world events. Well, let me say it a different way. The Antichrist would be able to reign over what would be the European Union if that was the case. So they wouldn't be kingdoms that existed in John's time. They were looking future forward. So in our modern times, could it become the European Union if a bunch of nations fall out? And then the tribulation starts, and man, there's only 10 nations in the European Union. Sure, it fits, no problem. That's fine. One's going to come out of what would be Rome, Italy, or that person's going to come out of what is a revived Roman Empire anyway, and the world is divided up into 10 economic, groupings of countries and whatnot. Again, you can look at it online, you can find it. We don't have to lose our minds trying to figure out which one this is or how it all fits. It's not given to us in enough detail. And whatever we think we might come up with today, if the Lord leaves us enough time here on this earth, we might find something 5 years down the road that's like, didn't see that 5 years ago, but it makes sense. Like what it was in the late 90s when we were thinking, it's the European Union, that fits. Well, now we look at this and say, maybe not so much with the numbers, but certainly the idea of the fragileness of whatever coalition they could put together and whatever the revived Roman Empire, everybody's got their own interests. And it will ultimately take one to subdue them all, that being the 8th king that comes out of them, the Antichrist. He's going to take control of it, and these other 10 kings are going to give to him whatever authority is granted to them. They're going to give it right back to him. We know that because we're told. Read on with me. So, chapter 13, verse 13. Well, we'll do verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw, these are also, the 10 horns, they are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they will receive authority for 1 hour as kings alongside the beast. And for the 1 hour, does that mean like 60 minutes? It can. Does it mean hour like the hour of judgment that's come, meaning a period of time that's not definite? It's just said, like when you think about when Jesus said, my hour has not yet come, that means a time, whatever it may be, days, weeks, whatever the case may be. The hour is just a way of saying a period of time. And yes, that same exact word in the Greek sometimes is used as an hour, 60 minutes, but other times it can be speaking about an event that will take place over an indefinite amount of time. It's just referred to as an hour. So if you wanted to look it up, you can see plenty of examples of it. It's not very difficult for us to see. So it's going to be taking place. It'll happen over a period of time. I don't think this is speaking about one literal hour. It's for a period of time, whatever it may be. Now, verse 13. So these 10 kings, they are of one mind, and they will give their power and their authority to the beast. So by the time he comes onto the scene and he's known and recognized, these 10 kings are all in place. Again, whether it's the European Union, it doesn't seem to fit currently where world events are, or if it's the 10, regions of the earth divided up into 10 regions that we see from those other, the globalist groups that have put together their own version of it. Whether it's them doesn't matter. When they're on the scene, the day will come when they're going to give everything that they have. They will follow him, and whatever they have, they will pledge to him. Bodies, the ability to make war, to do whatever it is that they're supposed to do, they're going to give it over to him. So these same ones, the Antichrist, the 10 kings, pretty much all of humanity, whatever's left, is going to try to make war against the Lamb. This is what we're going to read about when we get to chapter 19. And it says they will overcome, he will overcome the Lamb. Jesus will overcome them. Why? Well, because he's the Lord of Lords and he's the King of Kings. That's the exact title that we get in chapter 19. That's what John sees. When he comes back and he subdues the earth, he has written on his thigh, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So that means he's the sovereign above all sovereigns, and he is the master above all masters. Everybody he's above them all. And so that, for us, that's obvious. but he's going to demonstrate it, obviously, by what he does. So, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and those who are with him are called chosen, and they are called the faithful. And you get that in Zechariah chapter 14, verses, I think, 3 and 4. That tells us that he comes back and he steps foot on the Mount of Olives. But important, it tells us that there are saints who are with him. So that's the exact same imagery that we will see in chapter 19. And we see it here spoken of, that he comes back and there are those who are with him that are chosen. So we'll get into the details of that when we get to chapter 19 and dealing how that would work as far as chosen is concerned. Just of all of the options, it makes perfect sense that we're talking about the church that comes back with him because he's the head of the church, not talking about the martyrs because they are kept under the altar until his return. But these are people who are in heaven with him. And those are, obviously it figures that it would be the church. That's what makes sense, because it's the church that follows him wherever he leads as the lamb or the flock. Chapter 10 of John and plenty of other places that say the same thing. So there are those who are with him. They are called, chosen, and faithful. And then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits, these are peoples, multitudes, and they are nations. So if the question was, when he sees her and she's upon all these waters and all the rest, what is that symbolic of? We are already told right here. This is just the people that she rules over. And remembering again that though she is referred to as a city in verse 18, we also know that her scope and her influence is global, and it has been for, go back thousands of years, all the way back to Babylon, the city, and what happened before we knew it as Babylon, when it was referred to as Shinar, all the way Tower of Babel. We've already dealt with all of that. That's really when ultimately God had to confound the language, and the spirituality that was taking place back then was abominable. And so God wanted it confused, and he scattered the people. But if we want to see her as the city and as the personage, she's the one who gave birth to, she's the mother of harlotry, spiritually speaking, and the abominations of the earth, everything that comes because of spiritual infidelity to God. So all of the debauchery and the wickedness of occultism and every ism that has never bowed the knee to Jesus or to God before Jesus came onto the scene, that we would know, before the church, I guess you could say. But everything that had ever been as a rival, if you will, to the God of heaven, she's given birth to all of it. So that means it's not any one particular religion. Some people try to narrow it down to that. I'm sorry, that's just too narrowing of the scope, because she's the one who gave birth to all of the abominations of the earth and spiritual harlotry. So open the lens a bit and not narrowly define it to any one particular religion. So we can't call it apostate Christianity, because think of all the other abominations that have nothing to do with apostate Christianity, as some would say. So it tells us this. So he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits, these are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. It's very well traveled territory to use this as a way of saying it's everybody. All are involved here. And it says, and the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, not on the woman, on the beast, these will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. That will be done at the behest of the little horn, the Antichrist, because she's no longer necessary to him. He's consolidating all power, and he's going to use these kings and kingdoms to come after her and everything that she represents. It's going to be everything that she is going to be consumed and consolidated under him. Remember, even these kings are going to give their power and their authority to him. He will become that dictator. She's the obstacle, if you will, that kind of stands in the way. She has no power to withstand them. They're going to do his dirty work and deliver to him everything that they have, and he'll be that world dictator. Easy for us to understand. We already know him that way from chapter 13. We've seen that. So remember, John is seeing what has always been up to his current time, but he looks future at the events that will be during the tribulation. And then chapter 18 is when that actually takes place and she's actually destroyed. Remember, all of this is in the seventh trumpet. What happens to her is in that last of the trumpet judgment. So it didn't happen way back at some other time, and John's just talking about it in retrospect. It's all in that seventh bowl, not trumpet. It's in that seventh bowl, the last of the last things. Before the return of Jesus, Babylon is destroyed by the devil and all of his group. So, the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate, naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. We'll get all those details when we get into the 18th chapter. 4, here's the important part. 4, God has put it into their hearts. For what reason? To fulfill his purpose, his plan, his design. This is why when we're done here today with this study, I want to deal with that whole idea of the conspiracies. And when we see a lot of things with conspiracies, you get people who are really worked up about all of this stuff. But I want to make sure that we always point back. It's good to know. I mean, it's good to make mention of it. It gives us an opportunity to witness to people about it, because, you know, things are getting really weird in our world today. But ultimately, this is all playing out because God is ultimately in control. And I don't care who we're talking about, they still have to answer to him. I'll develop that a little bit when we get into the conspiracy things after the study. So it says, God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his. So he's going to make it where she becomes the problem, and they're gonna go and take care of business with her. But this is all playing out according to his plan. Not only how it's going to be done, when it's going to be done, to what extent, every last minutia bit of detail is all according to him, though the world will think that it's the Antichrist who's doing all of this stuff and it's his plan. It is not. It is God who's allowing him to do what he's doing, but none of it goes without God's consent, and it is by his ultimate design. None of this is like him sitting in heaven going, I wonder what's going to happen next. He already knows all those things, and this is him wrapping up his time with mankind as we know it, because he's about to enter into his millennial kingdom. When Jesus comes back, that's going to start the kingdom of the Lord on the earth here, leading to the eternity. We'll get to that when we work through the rest of Revelation. So it's going to, for God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. The words that we have already spoken, the things that God has already shown us, Daniel, the other parts of Revelation, anything that is speaking about this, maybe even this could even encompass things that we haven't been given as far as the details are concerned. But all of this is moving to the place when God can say, it's time for Jesus to come back, and he's going to put down their rebellion when he comes back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and settles this finally. That all happens. If you're wondering where that's about, you know, we've already dealt with that in the previous chapters. If you want to pick up, if you're just new to the program and haven't had a chance to check this out, you can pretty much start at chapter 13. That's kind of where we are at the time when the Antichrist is really revealed. Starts out at chapter 12 into chapter 13 and then onward. That kind of helps us with our understanding of how we get to this place. So all of this is being done so that everything that God has said would take place, takes place. And then we get to verse 18. The woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And so that the idea of reigning over, she's the one who introduces all of the spiritual harlotry, the abominations. She's the mother of it all. But all of it's going to turn against her because that's what God wants done. The Antichrist wants her out of the way. She's no longer convenient to him. She's just an obstacle. These kings are moved by the hand of God, and they want to be pleasing to the Antichrist. They take her out, giving their authority to him. Okay, so this idea that she is the mother of harlotry, absolutely, but she's also a city. So when she is judged and wiped out, that we'll read about in 18, it's to get rid of everything that she is. Now, I believe we're talking about the literal city of Babylon. Modern day Babylon is like old time Babylon as well, same kind of thing. It's all in that part of Iraq. But it's going to be putting down everything that she would represent as a rival in the religious sense. But even as far as the kingdom and what goes on in Babylon, remember the Antichrist is going to have his own kingdom that he comes out of. And this is just wiping out all of the rivals. He doesn't have to deal with the 10 kings because they're just saying, we're going to give you everything. Somehow here, he wants to go after Babylon and put her out. So she's done as far as everything that's there. No more reason for her abominations. The one who really gave rise to her ultimately is now in charge. The devil inhabits this Antichrist, so he's the ruler supreme in the political sense, religious sense. It's all there. Nobody can make war with him. They worship him. All of that stuff doesn't need a rival. He's getting rid of all of the stuff that might even be able to represent itself as a rival. So that settles chapter 17, hopefully. If you have any questions, you are certainly welcome to contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net. I'll be happy to go over any of the details about this. And that's where you can reach out to me for anything. That's the Israel trip that we have coming up in October. The details can be, you can request the details through that. But anything that you have questions on of this or any of our studies, please contact me through the ministry's website. I'd love to be able to hear from you. And then so as far as that's concerned, we can put a little neat, tidy bow on chapter 17. Hopefully that's answered all of the questions. And let me move on to, if I could, very briefly, the idea when it comes to conspiracies and things like that. I remember way back when, we were looking at really kind of what was the beginning of the European community and a bunch of other things that were going on. There were at the time a whole bunch of globalist groups that were a part of it. And, just even now today, some of them are still around, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, these globalist entities that are made up of various, countries. And the United States is very heavily involved with all of them because obviously we're the world power as far as this world is concerned. So there were all of those things going on at that time. We're talking, like 25, 30 years ago. Those were things I was looking into. And I remember way back when presenting on this, and there was some people we had advertised we were going to be talking about these things, and some people came that weren't even part of the church. They just came for those sessions that I had done, and they came up and they basically said, "What are you going to do about all this stuff?" I can't do anything I can't do anything about any of this stuff. It's the Lord who knows these things. And this is kind of the problem. They were of that conspiracy, this is a conspiracy, we've got to do something to overthrow it. But like what we just read here, you can't overthrow something that God is rolling out. This is him who's saying it's time. So what we have now in our world, it's become much, much, much different. And so the consolidation of power is different than any time that I've seen in my whole almost 40 years of being a believer. And that's just because the world is getting smaller because of technology and all the rest. And a lot of the conspiracy stuff that we see around us is based upon the technology that is available to us now. Now, when I say conspiracy, there are some people that just like they want to sound the alarm about every political figure, every person, especially with the new administration. Every person that's in the administration, there's somebody that wants to talk about a conspiracy with them. And there may be legitimate reasons for it. But the idea that they're all in on some kind of behind-the-scenes clandestine thing is just a kind of a bridge too far for me. Some of them may very well be. And we're starting to see a lot of different descriptions for them. And, one of the words that we hear all the time is Luciferians and the beast system. And there's a whole bunch of words that get used quite often. A beast system is going to be put in place. There's no question about it. The beast is going to come into power. He has a short amount of time. The whole of the tribulation is only 7 years. So the things that you need to run the world as a world dictator, there's got to be a lot of preparation that goes on. He's going to have to hit the ground running like never before. So what I always want to make sure that I caution people on this, do I think that the things that we're seeing taking place around us, the things that get pointed out all the time is AI and vaccinations and all of that kind of stuff. Those things are pointed to as things that are conspiratorial. The unsuspecting world is about to have a big surprise sprung on it, and we need to make sure that people are aware of this. Well, yes and no, because some of the things that they will point out, you just absolutely can't prove it. How much do they know? And let's face it, if you're not born again, regenerated by the Spirit of the living God, you're just an instrument for the devil himself. Doesn't mean that you got some kind of a shrine at your own house where you go and worship the devil at the end of the day. You're just doing his bidding. And I remember this is what it was like back before I was even saved, coming out of high school in those years. During high school and after high school, the music that was going on at the time, there were bands that had all kinds of imagery and whatnot that people said that they were Satanists. And when you hear them in interviews and all the rest of it, and when they talk about those things, you realize these are not serious people. They don't even know, especially when I became a new believer in those first years, there was still music that I was familiar with, and people that I was familiar with, bands that I was familiar with. And I started to understand it from a biblical perspective, and listening to what they had to say, it's like, these guys are clueless. It's just a shtick for them. These are guys that are just kind of using imagery for an effect. But then there were some bands, man, you listen to them, and some of the guys that were in those bands would say, we are avowed Satanists. Our music, you could read their lyrics, you just thought, these guys are really scary, scary people. Read their interviews. They were dedicated Satanists. So do they ultimately glorify the same things? Absolutely. But there's some people who really knew what they were doing, as opposed to the people who were just using it because it sold records. So I want to make sure that we understand that there's a distinction in that stuff too. As far as the people who are doing the things that they're doing behind the scenes, some of them are just nothing more than puppets, and they don't even realize what they're doing. Other ones are firm believers in those things. So to classify all of them as Luciferians, I think you just cheapen the idea that there are some people who are just being used and other people who really know what they're doing behind the scenes, and that they may be dedicated, avowed Satanists. So I always like to make sure that we're really careful with our terminology, because the world listens to us talk, and if we can do something that makes it easy to dismiss what we're saying because we use all kinds of incendiary language and jump to wild conclusions, we harm our witness. So I want to be really careful when I start to talk about that stuff. So just the idea with AI, let's face it, AI is an incredibly powerful tool. I think that it will have a major role when the Antichrist is introduced, as will the internet and a lot of other ways. That stuff, though, ultimately it's neutral. So AI is just a very, very fast supercomputing way of looking at all available detail and compiling it and putting it in place in fractions of the time that anybody could do if they're manually trying to find information on it. It's just supercomputing. But it's only as smart as the information that's there. AI is not sentient. It doesn't have a soul. It's just technology. So again, it's neutral. Can it be used for horrible, nefarious reasons? Absolutely, no question about it. But when people jump to conclusions, I think it's very, very harmful. Great example of it, when we wanted to go to Israel during the pandemic. We couldn't, because nations were shut down. You couldn't get, you couldn't get flights. The nations weren't open, and there was a time you could, but you had to be vaccinated. We didn't want to do it, and so we waited for that to be lifted. We were told by people that there's going to be digital ID, and you'll never be able to go there unless you're willing to do all this stuff. And stuff that I would never do. The passports, they were talking about digital passports to prove that you had all your vaccinations. I just wasn't interested in doing it. But they told me, well, you're never going to be able to go there unless you're willing to do it. We've been there twice since, and all of what we were warned about never came to pass. Do they have the ability for that kind of thing? Absolutely. But when people start to say it's going to be this way, and they start to put times on it, I'm sorry, you lost me, because I've watched too many times. They said that would be the case with the internet. The internet was going to be this, that, and the other thing. Now we're hearing AI is going to be this, that, and the other thing. Let's just admit that these are technologies that can be used for all kinds of horrible reasons, but it doesn't mean that the technology itself, in and of itself, is evil. It depends on whose hands it's in. Again, the internet. Prime example. I'm using the internet to put up these Bible studies. And if they are useful to anybody who listens to it, thank God for the technology, but it can be used for some very, very horrible, awful things. So the technology is the technology. It's neutral. It depends on who uses it and what they're doing with it. That's my view. People will disagree with that. But as far as conspiracies, sometimes the plain truth of it is just as crazy as it could ever be. So there's in philosophy, there's an old term, or there's a philosophic principle known as Occam's razor. And so in a philosophical sense, you can see the exact same information and people can come up with a whole lot of different explanations. Occam's razor is the premise of all of the possibilities. the one that's the simplest and the easiest to understand, that has the fewest moving parts, if you will, is probably the best example. It's probably the right answer. So there may be a lot of potentials, but man, when you've got to say, well, I believe it's this, and then this, and this is going to have to happen in order for that to be the outcome, is there a more simple possibility? Because maybe that's the one that works. So again, conspiracies and all the rest. I'll do one last one when it comes to the president. There were people that started to look at things that were said. So the golden age, they freaked out over that because that's new agey kind of stuff. When he talked about Gaza and rebuilding Gaza, see, dictator. And then an AI video comes out, which I just believe people are being trolled ultimately, because that's just kind of the thing. When I look at him, he's not a very globalist kind of guy, never has been. I look at his first administration, it wasn't really globalist. And so when I look at him, the idea of golden age can, sure, it can mean all that new age stuff that they're talking about, but he's not really kind of a new age guy. He's more of a builder kind of a guy. And the idea that he wanted to see America, prosper and do really well, a golden age can mean that's the pinnacle of any particular society. The golden age, we've heard the golden age of Hollywood, and that's when the movies and all the rest of it was the golden age. Everything that we can look at, you would say, has a golden age. If the nation is that, what's the best era of time? Some people will have different ways of determining what it is. So when I look at that and I hear golden age, do I think he's giving some secret code word for some new world order? Doesn't really fit his MO. Is he a guy who wants very much to be seen as the pinnacle of success, and that things under his control are like they've never been before? They may turn out to be everything those people are saying, but I don't think he's sending us code word for something. Again, people will disagree with me. I'll probably hear from them on this one, but I don't instantly jump to the most clandestine, smoke-filled room, insider information about any particular thing that is said. I don't default to that, though I know the devil is really, really good at all kinds of conspiratorial things. He will ultimately get what he wants, but at the end of it, it's God who makes the decisions. So whoever they may be, and I've said it this way before, show me the 5 most powerful, influential people on the planet. We may not even know their names. Whoever they are, give me the top of the top of the top of human food chain. I don't care who they are. Ultimately, they cannot do a single thing on this planet if God doesn't sign off on it. So they're powerless without him allowing them to do what they do. So I don't lose a lot of sleep over this person or that group or that organization or this technology. None of it can do anything to affect my life or anyone else's that God is not willing to have done. If we want to be able to be familiar with them enough to say the world's starting to take shape, and use it as a term for evangelism, but to lose your mind about it and run around like a chicken with your head cut off, you're not helping the kingdom. And I know people may get really mad at me for saying it, but let's have our heads on and look at things straight and understand that nothing that we can do by any of our exposés or anything else is going to change the course of it. You could take the U.S., the entirety of the United States, take us off the map, put us back into the Stone Age tomorrow. All this stuff will continue on no matter what, because it's going to get to that point. We're ending what we know as the history of mankind as we've always known it. The kingdom of God is going to be revealed at the end of the tribulation, and we're only talking 7 years at that point, and that could be moved on. The world's moving that way at an alarming rate. We want to be focused on the matters of the gospel, that we can use what we see going on around us, but not seem like we are just head in the clouds, talking past people that wouldn't have the slightest idea what we're talking about, unless we can do it in a very reasoned manner, in a very easy to understand kind of a way, how the scripture speaks about the consolidation of power into the hands of very few. Let's do that. That doesn't have to be conspiratorial. That's just what the Bible says. So, interesting topic. I'm sure I'll get plenty of feedback on this one. We will pick up at chapter 18 next week, looking at Babylon and her destruction.